All right, here we go. This is one of the turning points of World War II. I would say the Battle of Stalingrad in the European side and the Battle of Midway in the Pacific side were the two most significant battles that swung the war away from the Axis powers towards the Allied powers. Did you know that the Battle of Midway took place in the state of, well, it wasn't the state of Hawaii, did you know that the Battle of Midway took place in Hawaii? How about I put it that way? It was, Midway is way out here to the far west in the Hawaiian island chain. Here, of course, is Maui right here, and all the way out here is Midway. All right, so it's part of this in the entirety of the Hawaiian island chain from one end to the other. I like to point out on this map, this gives you an idea of how big actually Hawaii is. Did you know this? So this is what I just showed you overlaid across the mainland United States. Of course, there would be Midway way out there, probably the second or third dots. There we go, all the way back to what we consider the state of Hawaii. That's how big the chain is in and of itself. It's quite remarkable, actually. Okay, so the Battle of Midway took place in 1942, a mere 6 months almost to the day, 7 months almost to the day from the Pearl Harbor attack itself. All right. The Midway is part of, as I just mentioned, it's a part of the Hawaiian island chain. It's way up in the northwest part of the chain. Okay. You can go, my understanding is you can still go there for a visit. There's no cars, but there's no rental cars. You don't really need them. Midway is actually two islands that are part of an atoll. All right, let me show you exactly what it looks like. All right, so an atoll is sort of the top of a volcanic crater. It's almost enclosed. So here are the two main, Midway is actually a couple of islands. This is the main one. They both have naval, the U.S. naval base is mainly on the bigger island, and they both have, however, airfields / runways. All right, so that's what an atoll looks like. Okay, an atoll. The U.S. had a base there. All right, obviously, that's the main base, of course, was at Pearl Harbor, but there was a base there as well. This was actually not necessarily all at Midway, even though there was a direct attack on Midway. Most of the battle happened at sea. It's one of the great naval battles of history. All righty. Do you remember Yamamoto from our discussion of Pearl Harbor? He was the planner of this one as well. So he had the great success of Pearl Harbor, and of course short term. We recall that it was certainly short-term success, maybe not long-term success. But here was the plan. All right, so they had basically 4 of the aircraft carriers. If you recall, when they attacked Pearl Harbor, they used 6 aircraft carriers. They had 4. So really what they're trying to do is they're trying to complete what they were unable to accomplish at Pearl Harbor. And that was basically to eliminate the U.S. naval fleet in one single shot, in one single blow. Again, what they really want to hammer are the American aircraft carriers. That's the thing they are looking for. So what they do is they want to basically attack in 2 places, one in Alaska on the Aleutian Island chain, all right, and then Midway. And so what they hope to do is in between those 2 sets of islands, if you will, they want to trap the American fleet. That's the best way to put it. And if they can trap the American fleet there, they believe they can pinch off the head and destroy the American fleet for good. And the key, of course, however, is going to be the ability to take Midway. That is going to be what they think is going to be the more difficult process because the island of Midway is much more well fortified, not only defensively, but obviously there's going to be a lot more planes there than the Aleutian Islands. All right, so that's going to be the key force. And then what they hope is that the American force will get sent there looking for the Japanese and they'll be able to nail them. All right, so what is the size of the Japanese force? This is what they brought with them. Okay, so they had 4 of the 6 that they used at Pearl Harbor. These 4 did participate. These 4 aircraft carriers did participate in the Pearl Harbor attack. They have 15 submarines. And they have about 90 other ships. All right, and they have 280 planes altogether. Obviously, all of them based off of the 4 aircraft carriers. All right, so you got about 70. It works out to about 70 ships. I don't know if that's exactly perfectly, even though 4 into 280 is 70. I'm not sure if they all exactly held 70 specifically, but that's how many planes. You have 5,000 troops that are set for actual invasion and occupation. You know, this was not something that was set to happen on the Pearl Harbor attack. There were no troops that were brought along, dare I say, army troops, infantrymen who are going to, if you will, storm the beach of Oahu. That was never in the plan, but it was the plan for Midway. The American force, there are 3 aircraft carriers, and these are the 3 that the Japanese had hoped to sink at Pearl Harbor. And of course, needless to say, we commented about this, they were not there. They were out at sea. Okay, so the Japanese are still looking for them. These are the names of the ships: the USS Hornet, the USS Enterprise, and the USS Yorktown. All right, they had 24 other fighting ships, and they had 380 planes. So they have a little bit more number of planes than the Japanese do. All right. Some based on carriers, some based on Midway. Okay. Now, one of the problems that the Americans had, was that the Yorktown had been damaged. The Yorktown, of the 3 American carriers, the Yorktown was not in good shape. The Yorktown had been hit in another battle in the South Pacific, and it had been badly damaged. Damaged enough that it needed to be towed to be repaired. Now, the Japanese, who obviously they were the ones who inflicted the damage upon the Yorktown, they assumed that, so this is a very important and interesting part of this discussion. This will have significance later on. The Japanese assume that the Yorktown had to be towed to San Francisco. That was their assumption. They felt like it was badly enough damage that the only place it could get fixed was in San Francisco. It was not towed to San Francisco. It had in fact been towed to Pearl Harbor, and it was given basically given light repairs in literally 3 days. Okay. And the U.S. Navy repair guys were able to fix it in such a way that it was able to be used in this major battle. Okay, so one of the things we should talk about, and this is something that I think this is an aspect of all of World War II, I think, that is underreported, and that is the discussion of the use, there's a couple things. The use of radar, number 1, and the use of electronic codes and coding. All right? American code breakers were always busy at work. They were trying to decipher the Japanese transmissions and communications and the codes they were using. And of course, the Japanese tried to do the same with us. You just heard a discussion about the U.S. Indianapolis not being allowed an escort ship because that would imply that the Japanese had figured out the American codes. The code breaking was very serious stuff. Well, the American code breakers were good, and they had figured out the Japanese codes. And so therefore, the code breakers, the American code breakers in Honolulu, at Pearl Harbor, had already figured out what the Japanese were up to. They understood that Midway was going to be a target, and they generally knew when it was going to happen. So the element of surprise, while achieved at Pearl Harbor, was not going to be achieved at Midway. The U.S. carrier force was waiting. The U.S. carrier force was sent there to this area. Again, remember my description between Midway Island and the islands of the tail of the Aleutian Islands of the, I call it the tail of Alaska, that sort of swing sort of southwest and west away from Alaska, right in there. So the U.S. carrier force is waiting. All right. So the Japanese arrive and are ready to attack on the 4th of June, 1942. And basically, it starts off with an attack on Midway itself. There's an attack there. And this attack is deemed a success. They took out much of the anti-aircraft weaponry that the Americans had there. They beat up the Americans pretty good in this early morning attack, and it would have to be deemed nothing but a success. Now, remember what I said. They got 5,000 troops. There's 5,000 Japanese troops. Don't forget this now. There's 5,000 troops ready to invade Midway. Now, they didn't come in that first wave. They're going to come later on in the day. So there's going to be a second attempt. There's going to be a second attempt on Midway. And so the Japanese planes return to their carriers, and they prepare for another attack. Okay, so this is like reloading bullets, obviously. This is reloading bombs to blow up buildings and defense batteries, and even to a degree some runway stuff. Okay? Well, at that exact moment in time, at that exact key moment, this is the key thing right here. See, both sides are looking for each other. Both sides are looking for the other side's aircraft carriers. And it's at this exact moment where basically the battle turns. The Japanese planes are reloading, as I described, for another attack on Midway. Okay? The planes are on the decks of their aircraft carriers, getting refitted with new bombs. They're getting refueled. Okay? So all that stuff, bombs and gas, I think you can guess where I'm going with this. Bombs and gas are all up on the decks of the Japanese carriers. Well, suddenly, okay, the Japanese get a report that the U.S. carriers have been spotted. Now, this is their main target. All right? And so the decision is, we have to go, instead of attack Midway, the island, a second time, we now have to go attack these U.S. carriers. Now, you may think, okay, well, what's the big deal with that? Well, you have to use different types of weaponry for two different types of attacks. How do you sink a ship? Well, you sink a ship with torpedoes. Okay, so all those Japanese planes who were busy getting reloaded with drop bombs that are going to be dropped on land, dropped on buildings, now have to get reloaded. They have to change and get armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes loaded onto their planes. So they stop the reloading process. They bring up torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs up to the decks. Okay, you got all kinds of weapons all over the decks of all four aircraft carriers. Guess what happens at this exact moment? I think you have guessed it. Guess who shows up? American planes. They sight the four Japanese carriers. And these guys are, first of all, they are, the first ones that come in are American torpedo planes. They come in low. I think you recall that from the discussion about Pearl Harbor. And they are fought off. The very first attack of American planes is fought off because they come in low. But now, guess what happens? The dive bombers from above, the American dive bombers from above, they come in full blast and they hit these Japanese aircraft carriers that are full of planes, full of fuel, and full of bombs. And they end up sinking 3 Japanese carriers really by noon that day. It is the attack from above is devastating to the Japanese, absolutely devastating. And they're mainly guys from the USS Enterprise. So you can see that there are 3 out of 4 Japanese carriers sunk. Planes from all 4 Japanese carriers are up in the air. And as U.S. planes get finished, they're running out of gas, they have to go back to their own carriers. They are followed by Japanese planes. Okay, so this is a big game of really sort of cat and mouse here. Okay, so Mr. O'Brien, how does this? They sank the Japanese carriers. They sank 3 of the 4. Japanese planes from the 4th carrier are the ones who follow these planes back to their carriers. Well, sure enough, the Japanese pilots arrive, and they are expecting to see 2 aircraft carriers. Remember, they are assuming that the Yorktown has been towed back to San Francisco. It has not. The Yorktown is there. And the Japanese are absolutely shocked to discover that there are 3 U.S. aircraft carriers, not 2. And so the fight goes on above the American carriers, and it is the Yorktown that is the most damaged by the Japanese. The Yorktown is in very bad shape. Americans have to abandon the Yorktown. It still remains afloat, but they can't risk having people on it, so they abandon it. Okay. Now, same thing is going to happen. Now the Japanese planes have to fly back to their remaining character. Who's going to follow them? Well, the U.S. planes are going to follow those Japanese planes back to their remaining carrier, and by 5 in the afternoon, the 4th Japanese aircraft carrier is sunk. Right? So the whole thing has taken about probably about 12 hours in total. Probably early AM flight attack at Midway originally, maybe 5 or 6 in the morning. 12 hours later, there are 4 Japanese aircraft carriers at the bottom of the sea. Just so you know, the Yorktown is eventually sunk. It's sunk 2 days later. One of the Japanese submarines sinks it. As it's being towed back to Pearl Harbor. It takes 14 hours to sink, but it does end up sinking. Okay, so let's go through a couple of, there's a number of things. I guess I'm going to make 7 points here, then I'll sort of maybe add a picture or 2 to make you see a little bit better what this story is all about. This is obviously the huge moment, and this completely swings the war in the Pacific in the favor of the Americans. And basically, up until this point, the Japanese had been nothing but successful, and not just Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had been successful before Pearl Harbor in attacks in various places in Asia and Southeast Asia. All right? They had always been on, shall we say, the offensive. Okay? Well, at this particular time, that changes. They are unable to be offensive from that one point on. And we obviously can deduce why. The majority of a huge part of their fleet has been lost. I think that something is very fascinating about this is that you think about it. When those 4 Japanese carriers went down, yeah, you've got planes and stuff, and yes, of course, the boats themselves go down, but they have a huge loss of life as well. And a significant and important aspect of this that I think gets lost are the types of people who are killed in these situations. And if you think about it, this is very significant. A lot of Japanese mechanics were killed in this battle. A lot of technicians, a lot of people who did the basics, that did the building, that did the repairs of anything that was damaged. People that fix things are killed. This is going to be a very significant aspect of this. American losses are obviously not as bad. The Americans only lose 360 men. A number of planes, I will grant you, but only 362 men. And so this is the whole point about this, is that the ability to be offensive, which is what the Japanese certainly wanted, that's over, that's done. They're not going to be able to be that way. And they're going to be on the defensive. Now this war obviously is going to last for another 3 long years, but all the gains that, we could make another map, as we've made maps of certainly Napoleon's empire and Hitler's empire. We even made one of the British Empire. And all those things eventually grow to a certain size, even back in world history days when we made the Roman Empire map. Those things all eventually shrink. It's the same story here. The Japanese empire grew to be quite large, but from this point on, it's going to shrink, shrink from this point on. Okay, so is this something that the Japanese newspapers and everybody, it was front page of the newspaper? No, the answer is no. It was kept a secret back home. Anybody, any sailor, pilot, anybody associated with this battle, if they survived, they were separated from each other and put in different hospitals. They were dispersed, non-injured people were dispersed to different areas so they couldn't talk about it. Really only high-ranking military people knew. And it really was the beginning of, Yamamoto was really very hesitant about fighting the United States. He thought it would be, he described it as waking a sleeping giant. That's how he believed that, that's why he believed that an attack like Pearl Harbor, and that didn't work perfectly, in a second, one-shot swoop, one-hit wonder to knock the U.S. Navy out was the only way to beat the United States, because once they got going, it would be like waking a sleeping giant. And so this is exactly what happened. And so the bad news had to be kept, all right? I always think this is sort of interesting. Apparently there was a lot of, apparently the Japanese pilots above Pearl Harbor, apparently they took tons of pictures and tons of video. And that stuff was all existed. Wouldn't that be something to see those types of things today? Wouldn't that have been something to see the footage of the Pearl Harbor attack from the Japanese point of view above Pearl Harbor? How much more could be learned about the Pearl Harbor attack? But all of those photos, I think this is very interesting, all of that video was lost as the 4 Japanese carriers went down. And I'll say this, that we call this is very interesting when we look back on the days of Napoleon, and of course we discussed the Battle of Trafalgar, where the British under Nelson did that famous attack, but those ships all had to get close to each other, didn't they? That naval battle had to have ships close to each other so they could blast each other out of the water. This is a different type of, this is the first, really one of the first great battles of human military history. We call it a naval battle, but neither navy spotted each other. There were no boats that spotted each other across the open sea. All of this naval battle was fought in the skies, either planes versus planes or planes attacking boats. Okay? So quite interesting if you think about that in that fashion. All right? So let me just share a couple other pictures with you. This is a famous, famous sort of artwork type thing. These are American style, basically high-level dive bombers. These guys get their planes up at high altitude and they drop from the skies and they drop straight down and they try to hit these things. This is sort of an inside look at what this sort of looks like. There's a pilot here. This guy could sit. This one's sitting forward, but they could sit backwards, and sometimes they had a gunner that they could fight back if somebody was behind them, a faster plane was behind them. But again, they're trying to get, there's your aircraft carrier that is coming in for a landing on, it looks like. Okay, so this sort of famous looking thing. Did you know that a plane like this is, there's a plane in the, right off the coast of Kihei, by the way. I don't know if you knew this or not, but this is something that you can go diving on if you are into that kind of thing. That's right off the coast of Kihei. And this was basically a plane that went down on a sort of a training run. I believe it was maybe a couple years after World War II, but it's down there. It's not in very deep water, my understanding. This was in the Maui News not too long ago. But it was sort of always a well-known thing that scuba divers knew about. Here's some, you can even sort of see the dashboard of the pilot's seats. Some of the gauges are still there. It's kind of cool, right? So I don't know if you knew about that, but that's a very similar type plane to this, this plane right there. Okay. Now, if you want to go to if you want to go to Midway today, you can do so, like I mentioned. But apparently, Midway is a great bird sanctuary, seabird sanctuary today. That's one of the things it's mostly well known for. Here is an old U.S. naval gun, and of course, there's all the seabirds. That's kind of a fun picture. I knew a family that went and took a vacation to Midway, and one of the comments was it was very quiet and very slow, but the water was the clearest water they had ever seen. So they had a great time on their visit to Kihei. No rental cars. They had to go around on golf carts, apparently. Okay, apparently there's one hotel on Midway, but strictly golf carts there. All right? How about that? That's kind of interesting, right? All right. I hope you liked the discussion of the Battle of Midway, one of the most significant events of the 20th century.